right, Headliner Nation, let me read you a few wide receiver names. Troy Franklin, Courtland Sutton, Jalen Waddle, Ladd McConkey, Keenan Allen, Quentin Johnston, Deebo Samuel, and Ja'Marr Chase. We'll be missing all of those wide receivers this week because of buys and Chase is suspended. But how about these names? Khalil Shakir, Kayshon Boutte, Marvin Harrison Jr., Brian Thomas Jr., Drake London, Chris Godwin. All players currently listed as questionable that we don't know about as of this recording. That is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 different wide receivers that we either will not have or don't know anything about yet. So yeah, we might have to take a few risks this week, and it doesn't feel great. And we'll start on Thursday Night Football, where Khalil Shakir being questionable for personal reasons is throwing a little bit of a wrench into what we should do with the Buffalo Bills. Now, honestly, I don't think that we really want to play anyone from the Bills wide receiver core right now. Why? Houston allows the second fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Last week, there were 10 different players that got a target. Khalil Shakir is questionable right now. We don't even know if he is going to play. Keon Coleman, he found himself benched last week. There's a lot going on here. You could take a shot at Gabe Davis if you want to. He has a connection with Josh Allen, and maybe he sees a deep play or two. But honestly, on Thursday Night Football and this matchup, tell me honestly, would you want to play anybody from Buffalo anyway? Really, the only wide receiver I want to play in this matchup is Nico Collins, because he's the best and he's been the most consistent throughout the season. He's playing very well right now. Over the last couple of games, he's been the wide receiver 5 and wide receiver 3, and that's with Davis Mills at quarterback, not even CJ Stroud. He has 10 or more targets in his last 4 games. He's going to get the volume. Buffalo's not a great matchup. They allow the 10th fewest fantasy points per game, but we know the floor should be there for him in a matchup where Houston probably trails. Pittsburgh going up against the Chicago Bears, who are currently allowing the 9th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. For right now, I gotta list DK Metcalf as a fringe start. It sounds like Aaron Rodgers is going to try and practice on Friday, but we are not certain whether or not he's going to be able to play with that fracture in his wrist. Over the last 3 weeks, DK Metcalf has been the wide receiver 82, 50, and 35. So things have not been great. So in no way is DK Metcalf a must start this week based on his recent performances and the fact that he might have Mason Rudolph as his quarterback. We'll obviously update that much later in the week when we know for sure whether or not Rodgers is playing. So for right now, DK Metcalf has to stay at the fringe. I think there's an opportunity for each of the Chicago wide receivers in this matchup. I don't know what got into Pittsburgh last week. They completely shut down Cincinnati, but was it more on Cincinnati than Pittsburgh? Is this going to be a trend moving forward where Pittsburgh plays much better defense than they have earlier in the season? They're still allowing the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers right now. So I'll obviously go with Rome Odunze. He's back on track after a couple of weeks ago when he only got 3 targets and really let down fantasy owners. Since then, he's looked a whole lot better, and him and Caleb Williams are on the same page. Luther Burden and DJ Moore have very limited upside, and they have a floor that you don't feel great about. But in a week where Chicago is probably going to be throwing it more than running it, I would anticipate both of these guys each seeing at least 5 targets. New England and Cincinnati, Kayshon Boutte is still questionable as of right now. He is going to be practicing, but as of this recording, we don't know whether or not he'll actually be able to play. So we're going to keep him as questionable for right now, but whether or not he plays doesn't matter because Stefon Diggs is going to be a start for us. 11 targets last week for Diggs, and he caught 9 of them for 105 yards. In terms of volume, he's the most consistent wide receiver on this team right now. Actually, he's the most consistent pass catcher on this team right now. And he is a guy that I definitely believe that we can lock in as a wide receiver 3 moving forward. And if you have him as your wide receiver 2, which you shouldn't, because if you do, you have terrible depth, you can use him as a wide receiver 2 more than likely. Just know that he isn't going to have all the upside in the world every single week. If Kayshon Boutte returns this week, he's going to be a fringe start for touchdown upside, and he does steal a little bit of ceiling away from Stefon Diggs. Well, no Ja'Marr Chase this week for Cincinnati after he was suspended, then he appealed it, then it was upheld for spitting on Jalen Ramsey. After watching the video, Ja'Marr Chase, do you really think that nobody was going to notice what you did? So T. Higgins is going to be the guy this week, and he's been playing very well, and now he's going to get basically a majority of the volume with Joe Flacco. Higgins has a touchdown in 4 straight games, and he has 5 touchdowns during that time as well. Only one game with Joe Flacco since he arrived in Cincinnati does T. Higgins have less than 8 targets. So he's good for at least double-digit targets this week with no Ja'Marr Chase. Andrei Iosivas is an emergency option at wide receiver this week with no Ja'Marr Chase, who's been averaging upwards of 20 targets sometimes per game. He's definitely going to have an opportunity to see some targets this week. Him and Noah Fant were both guys that I list as fringe starts because with no Ja'Marr Chase, the ball's going to have to go to somebody other than just T. Higgins. Even though Detroit's defense isn't fully 100% right now, they have still been playing very, very well, and they've been shutting down some good teams like the Philadelphia Eagles. So Wan'Dale Robinson for me this week is not any type of a smash start. He still got 9 targets last week, but he only caught 4 of them for 36 yards. I would much rather see Jackson Dart under center for him this week than I would want to see Jameis Winston. But as of right now, Jackson Dart still has not been cleared. He could actually probably be cleared before this video comes out, but I doubt that happens. We might not know until Thursday or Friday whether or not he's ready to go. As far as the other wide receivers go, I'm not going to risk it with anybody else outside of Wan'Dale Robinson, who I already don't love. Remember back in week 1 when the Lions lost to the Green Bay Packers and then came home the next week after that and put 50 up on the Chicago Bears? Or remember when they lost a close one to the Kansas City Chiefs and then came home the week after that with basically no secondary and beat the Tampa Bay Buccaneers? Detroit's going to be ready to roll this week going up against the New York Giants, and their wide receivers are going to be a big part of that. The Giants are still allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Amon-Ra St. Brown hasn't shown a ton of upside as of recent, but I think he's back on track this week, and he's still getting a ton of volume. Jameson Williams is making some big plays right now, and this week against the New York Giants, I expect him to do some of the same. He has a touchdown in 3 straight games and 4 of his last 5. He's been the wide receiver 14, 3, and 5 over the last 3 games. Minnesota's offense is tough to watch right now. I get it. With J.J. McCarthy having some trouble finding his footing right now, there is a lot of growing pains, and at some point in time, I still believe he will end up being just fine. But Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison are suffering because of it. Justin Jefferson right now is a safer play than he is a high upside play. When we look at him realistically, he's more like a wide receiver too. Now, here's the good news. Since week 3, in every single game, he's had at least 9 targets. He's only scored 2 touchdowns on the season, one of which has come since week 1, so he's not presenting a ton of upside, but the floor has been there with the amount of targets he's getting. Jordan Addison, a little bit more touchdown dependent for me. Since he returned after his suspension in week 5, he has 3 touchdowns. So he actually has 1 more touchdown in a shorter time frame than what Justin Jefferson does. Minnesota's not going to be easy for Green Bay, especially with the way their offense has played as of late, but Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson will both be fringe starts for me in a matchup where Minnesota only allows the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. When you take a look at these 2 players, you've got one with a high floor and one with a high ceiling. Doubs is the one with the high floor. If you remove week 10 when he left early, since week 4 this season, he has averaged just over 8 targets per game. So he's getting a ton of targets. And again, if you take out that game that he left early, over 8 targets a game is very solid if you're looking for someone with a pretty decent floor. Christian Watson is only averaging 4 targets a game since he came off the IR and he's been back from his injury. So he doesn't have nearly the floor that Romeo Doubs does, but he does have a much higher ceiling, especially after you saw him score 2 touchdowns last week. He's the guy with the big playability. Seattle going up against Tennessee, who's currently allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Clearly restarting JSN, that's not even a question mark at this point. The question after that is, what about Rashid Shaheed? After trading for him, Torrey Horton has been injured. And if Torrey Horton can return this week, it definitely puts in doubt whether or not we would want to play either of those guys. But if Torrey Horton were to miss once again, I would actually move Rashid Shaheed up to a fringe start and list him as a very risky wide receiver 3 with a little bit of big play upside. This is a solid matchup, and it's one of those matchups where Seattle wants to get back on track, especially Sam Darnold after 4 4 interceptions last week. JSN will get his no matter what. But in a matchup like this, coming off the game they just had, I really think Seattle looks to take a couple of shots in this game. I don't see any benefit to playing any wide receiver from Tennessee this week. Seattle allows the 9th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, and the only wide receiver that we had been looking at over the last few weeks is Chimere Dike, and that's because if you play in a league where you get points for return yards, he was actually putting up pretty solid yards, but for those of you that don't get points for that, it didn't matter because he wasn't fantasy viable whatsoever. It's a tough matchup. Tennessee hasn't been good on offense. I'll just stay away from it this week. The Indianapolis at Kansas City matchup is going to bring a ton of risk at the wide receiver position, which is not what we need this week, where we're going to be missing a ton of wide receivers as it is. Michael Pittman is the safest option for Indianapolis. He's the guy that's going to give you volume, touchdown potential, everything you want. And in a matchup against Kansas City where you're going to have to throw the ball, Michael Pittman hopefully will be the #1 target on offense. Josh Downs, I'm going to sit Josh Downs because if for any reason Indianapolis has trouble moving the football, Josh Downs loses a ton of value. Downs really is going to make his mark in the red zone as a very touchdown dependent play this week. Alec Pierce, he can strike from everywhere on the field. And I'm sure Daniel Jones is going to look his way at least 4 or 5 times this week. 2 of them will be really deep plays that if he connects with would make his entire fantasy day. And yeah, Indianapolis is still allowing the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. But coming out of the bye week, hopefully Sauce Gardner is definitely caught up on what he needs to do to start integrating into the defense a little bit more, and he can help shut down these wide receivers. The one guy that I think Kansas City keeps away from him is Rashee Rice. Keeping him in the slot as much as they can this week will keep him away from Sauce Gardner. And if that ends up happening, Rashee Rice probably could end up seeing close to 10 targets, if not 10 plus targets this week. What is going to happen with the New York Jets offense moving forward? Well, I can tell you moving forward for me this week, I'm not risking it with any of these wide receivers. John Mechie scored a touchdown last week, but it was announced earlier in the week that they are moving to Tyrod Taylor now. So what does that mean? Who's going to get the most targets? Are they going to push the ball down the field? Will Tyrod look to Mason Taylor? Are they going to run the football more than they have been? Going up against Baltimore this week, on paper, it's a solid matchup because Baltimore is allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. But Baltimore also has been playing much better on defense as of late. Last week was the first time since week 1 that Zay Flowers finished inside the top 24 wide receivers. He has not been very good this season. And even after a decent week last week, if you take a look at the box score, a majority of his yards only came on 1 play. That's not the definition of consistency that I want moving forward for Zay Flowers. So this week, he's going to be a fringe start going up against the New York Jets. I think he ends up seeing the most targets of any of the players for the Baltimore Ravens. But if Baltimore gets out to a lead early and they shut down the New York Jets, I don't think they're going to be throwing the ball an awful lot this week. This is a great matchup for Cleveland, but it looks like Shedeur Sanders may be starting at quarterback. And based on what we saw last week, it could end up being a rough week. If I have to give one guy an opportunity to play, it's going to be Cedric Tillman. And Cedric Tillman was a guy that I liked at the beginning of the season. Last year, for a short stint, he looked like a high upside, big playability guy that didn't need a ton of targets to be fantasy viable. And he saw a big play last week that kind of showcased that once again. There's a lot of risk involved with playing any of these wide receivers. And I know a lot of people are going to want to flock to Jerry Jeudy over Cedric Tillman. But me personally, I want to give the shot to the guy that only needs a couple of plays to make it happen, and that's Cedric Tillman. If you give him 5 targets, but you give Jerry Jeudy 9 targets, there's an opportunity for Cedric Tillman to make more out of less with his ability right now. Cleveland's allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, so it's not the best matchup in the world for any of these Las Vegas wide receivers to show us a ton of fantasy value this week. Tyler Lockett and Geno Smith, they're connecting a little bit since his signing, but Trey Tucker is the guy. And I know a couple of weeks ago he did absolutely nothing, but last week against Dallas, he looked a lot better. 8 targets, caught 4 of them for 47 yards, and had a touchdown. That's not great potential every single week. I'm not saying he's a wide receiver 1 1 or even a wide receiver 2. But I hope that those type of numbers to end the year at least give us a flex option in Las Vegas, especially in matchups like this. What will we see from the Jacksonville offense this week? And right now, we don't know about Brian Thomas Jr. and whether or not he will be ready to go. But what we do know is Parker Washington and Jakobi Meyers have been the two guys who have been most fantasy relevant since Brian Thomas Jr. went down with his injury. Now, Tim Patrick scored a touchdown last week. I'm not even going to add him to the slide right now. But moving forward, Parker Washington and Jakobi Meyers seem to be the two guys that we should rely on the most. The question is, if Brian Thomas Jr. returns, who ends up taking a backseat to him? Jakobi Meyers' 6 targets last week led the team, and since he came over in that trade, he has over 100 combined yards in 2 games. So he's getting looks right off the bat, which is good news for those of you that have been holding on to him. For Parker Washington, he had 26 targets in 3 games and was a top 24 wide receiver twice before this performance last week. So he's been showcasing some ability as well. And if there's no Brian Thomas Jr. this week, both of these guys are fringe starts. If Brian Thomas Jr. were to return, I would say BTJ becomes a fringe start, and if I had to go with one or the other, I would say Jakobi Meyers would be the other fringe, while Parker Washington becomes a sit. I doubt we see Marvin Harrison Jr. this week. He hasn't officially been ruled out as of yet, but after the appendectomy, they said it could take up to 2 weeks for him to return. So as of right now, I'm going to operate under the impression that Michael Wilson will be the main wide receiver again. And I'll tell you what, those numbers last week were crazy. 18 targets, 15 receptions, 185 receiving yards. He's going to be a start once again if there's no Marvin Harrison Jr. If Marvin Harrison Jr. does return this week in this matchup, I would be willing to list both of them as fringe starts. There is a whole lot of potential for a whole lot of points in this matchup with Philadelphia and Dallas, especially from the wide receiver position. So let's go ahead and make Philadelphia and Dallas my underdog must-watch matchup at the wide receiver position here in week 12. And with the season coming to a close, maybe your fantasy year didn't turn out exactly how you wanted it to. Or maybe you're rocking it in fantasy and you still just want to partake in a little extra fun. Well, the only way to do that is to join us over on Underdog. For those of you still playing right now for something in your fantasy leagues, add Underdog as a little bit of an extra way just to have some fun with football the rest of the season. But for those of you who are out of your playoff run, hey, let's go over to Underdog and let's keep playing for a little something every single week with their pick'ems or best ball games. And if you go download the Underdog app and use code Headliners when you deposit at least $10, you're gonna get a super special pick'em that's almost guaranteed to hit, as well as up to $100 in bonus bets when you play your first matchup. I've had a lot less fun for a lot more than $10. Underdog is a great way to celebrate the end of the season and have a lot of fun whether or not you're still in it for your fantasy leagues. Obviously, they're going to force the ball to A.J. Brown after everything that happened last week. 11 targets ended up leading the team. Didn't do a ton with those 11 targets, but going up against Dallas this week, he could definitely do a whole lot more. Dallas is still allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Typically, both of these guys are fringe starts for me, but this matchup is way too juicy. If you own these guys, you're going to play these guys because they both have a ton of upside. Obviously, their floor is still risky because that's just the way it is in this offense with these guys, but they both could go off and have top 12 weeks. For CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens, these guys continue to eat together. George Pickens hasn't gone anywhere since CeeDee Lamb returned from his injury, and CeeDee Lamb acts like he hasn't even missed a step after his injury. Both of these guys are playing extremely well right now and are the centerpiece of any fantasy lineup that owns them. There's not much to say about the Atlanta wide receivers this week. Drake London was moved to doubtful during this recording, so it doesn't sound like he's going to be able to go this week, which was kind of what we were anticipating. Darnell Mooney, he's still questionable as of right now. If Mooney plays without Drake London, I would be willing to put him as a fringe start, but just keep in mind the last time that happened and Drake London ended up becoming a surprise inactive on game day, Darnell Mooney also didn't do anything with Kirk Cousins, who's going to be starting this game as well. So he's a very risky option, but he's still going to be a fringe start given the matchup and the fact that he's the only wide receiver that I would even consider. I think it's unrealistic to expect Chris Olave to have the ceiling that we saw prior to the bye every single week. He had 8 targets, caught 5 of them for 104 yards, and scored a touchdown. He was the wide receiver 3. But it's those 8 targets that I'm keying on because he still has a ton of volume this season. We saw a little big playability, which would be great from time to time, but it's the floor that we want to play him with because he has at least 8 targets in all but 2 games this season. I would like to say that the only question I don't have at the wide receiver position right now is Emeka Egbuka, but unfortunately, that might not be accurate anymore. Egbuka has really fallen off over the last 5 weeks. During the last 5 weeks, he only has 1 game where he has finished higher than wide receiver 35. Now, for one of those games against San Francisco, he got hurt in. The game after against Detroit, he wasn't 100%. But since then, he's been wide receiver 55, wide receiver 4, and wide receiver 44. And this matchup against the Rams is not great. Outside of that, Chris Godwin, he's at practice, but he continues to be questionable. Tez Johnson didn't do anything last week. And Sterling Shepard, out of everybody, was the guy that was the most trustful last week. But I'm not going to trust him moving forward. I don't think that Sterling Shepard is the guy that we're going to rely on for that type of volume every week with the other weapons that they have. Last week, Puka had another very solid day, but the most important thing about that day was he came out of it without an injury, because it feels like Puka gets banged up every single week. This past week, didn't happen. Let's hope for a lot of health for Puka Nacua going forward. For Davante Adams, he is banged up right now, and he may still be a little limited. Last week, he had 8 targets, but he was only able to bring in 1 of them. It ended up being a touchdown. This week against Tampa Bay, hopefully he's a little bit healthier, and those 8 targets, if he gets them again, are a little more productive. I think it's very unrealistic for any of us to expect Ted McMillan to have that type of week every single week. But it was good to see because he hasn't had a ton of ceiling. This was his first wide receiver 1 game since back in week 6. Being inside the top 12 is not something he has become used to so far this season. And some of that has to do with his quarterback, Bryce Young, who, lo and behold, had a huge week last week. Now, Ted McMillan has a solid matchup going up against San Francisco that allows the 5th most fantasy points per game. And based on how he played last week, Ted McMillan obviously is going to be a start for us. One thing that I know for certain, we can continue to expect volume, so his floor will be solid. But expecting top 12 numbers every single week is not something that's going to happen all the time. The wide receivers for San Francisco have a bit of a tougher matchup for themselves this week. Carolina's allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Juwan Jennings is the most consistent wide receiver they have right now. Ricky Pearsall still working his way back from injury. It might take a couple of weeks. And this is another tough matchup. So personally, unless you have to start Ricky Pearsall, I would look for a wide receiver with a better matchup. And if Pearsall plays better this week, it is great for some of the really easy matchups that he has moving forward. Headliner Nation, hopefully you found the information in the video helpful towards starting to put together your fantasy lineups in week 12. We're not going to lock anything in as of right now, but you should have a really good idea at running back, tight end, and wide receiver what you want to do. And of course, we have quarterbacks coming out after this video, and when the rankings come out, that is when we'll really lock in exactly what we want to have in our fantasy lineup for week 12. Best of luck to everybody this season. Before you leave, hit the like button, subscribe, bell notification, all of the good stuff, but more importantly, stay safe and healthy, and I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.